He stood in the lobby, confident, when their eyes locked. The passenger he'd refused the day before was now his boss. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the full weight of the situation. What happened next would change everything. But let's start from the beginning. It was a typical rush hour in downtown Chicago. The streets buzzed with honking cars and the hurried shuffle of pedestrians, each person consumed by their own frustration as they navigated the crowded sidewalks. David, a taxi driver who had seen it all, was weaving his way through the chaotic traffic when he noticed a man standing on a street corner. The man was waiting for a ride, dressed in a sharp suit, clearly someone who valued appearance. He was in his late 30s, with a confident yet quiet presence. But something about him caught David off guard. As he pulled up to the curb, he took a quick glance at the man. His calm, measured stance didn't sit well with David, who couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was just the exhaustion that had begun to gnaw at him after hours on the road. Or maybe it was the quiet tension in the air, the kind that always signaled a potential problem. The man was black. The weight of that fact seemed to settle over David, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't a conscious thought, but the feeling lingered in his gut, a discomfort he had long carried. It was easy to pretend he was simply tired, that he didn't have the patience for another passenger, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Without giving it a second thought, David rolled down the window, his tone clipped and dismissive. "I'm not taking you," he said, as if dismissing a beggar on the street. "Find another ride." The man, James, as David would later learn, paused. For a split second, his eyes narrowed in disbelief, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. But then, the anger followed. "Excuse me?" James's voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it now, a sting David hadn't anticipated. David, unbothered, repeated his refusal. "I said no," he added, shaking his head with finality. James stood still, as if taking a moment to collect himself. The streets were loud, but for a brief moment, everything seemed to fall silent. James turned without another word and walked away, his footsteps ringing in the quiet air. David watched him go, a strange sense of unease settling in his chest, though he couldn't understand why. The next morning, David walked into the taxi company's small office, already feeling the weight of the previous day's encounter pressing down on him. As he stepped into the cramped room, he noticed his manager, Greg, sitting at the desk with a stack of papers in front of him. Greg, a middle-aged white man, had an air of seriousness about him as he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," Greg said, his voice professional, almost detached. David took a seat, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had lingered since the day before. He could feel the tension in the room, but didn't know where it was coming from. "We've got a new boss," Greg continued, glancing at the papers in front of him, as if the words he was about to say didn't affect him at all. "His name is James Carter, and he's been promoted to lead operations." David's heart sank. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. James Carter. The same man he had refused to pick up just hours ago. The man he had dismissed without a second thought. He suddenly felt like he was suffocating, the walls of the small office closing in around him. How could this be happening? He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What do you mean, lead operations?" David stammered, trying to wrap his head around it. His pulse quickened as realization dawned on him. Greg didn't look up from the papers. "He's your boss now," he said, his tone cool and indifferent. "And I suggest you respect that." David's mind raced. No, this can't be real. The man he had just humiliated was now in charge of everything, of his job, his future, everything. The thought of it churned in his stomach like a bad meal. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. He sat frozen, unable to process the implications. He had insulted the very person who held his fate in his hands now. The feeling of dread that washed over him was undeniable. It wasn't just about losing his job. It was the crushing weight of knowing how deeply he had misjudged someone. The irony was almost too much to bear. Later that day, David found himself face to face with James again. This time, however, the man wasn't just another passenger. He was someone entirely different. Still dressed in his sharp, well-fitted suit, James's presence had shifted dramatically. His posture was straighter, more commanding. As David walked into the office lobby, he saw James engaged in a conversation with one of the other employees. But the moment David stepped closer, their eyes met. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to freeze. James's gaze locked onto him, cold and unblinking. His face hardened, and the recognition was instant. "You," James said, his voice controlled but dripping with disdain. "You're the one who refused to take me yesterday." David's heart skipped a beat, and he could feel the rush of heat flood his face. He opened his mouth, ready to mumble an apology, but before the words could escape, James cut him off. "I didn't ask for an apology," James interrupted, his tone unyielding. "I want to know why you thought it was okay to make that call. I'm curious. What was going through your mind?" The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. David's mind went blank, his defenses crumbling as guilt and shame washed over him. His instincts screamed for him to explain himself, to justify his actions, but the words wouldn't come. There was no excuse, no easy way out. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. But then, just as David thought he might drown in the weight of his mistake, James's expression softened ever so slightly. He took a slow breath, his eyes narrowing, and spoke again, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're still here, David. That's a choice I'm letting you make." James paused, his gaze cutting through him like a knife. "But this," he shook his head slightly, "this kind of behavior will never be tolerated here. Understood?" David swallowed hard, nodding instinctively, his throat tight. The full weight of his actions crashed over him, a force he couldn't escape. The mistake he had made, the prejudice he had acted on so thoughtlessly, now loomed over him like a shadow. He had been blind, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. Days passed, and David couldn't shake the feeling of dread every time he saw James around the office. He felt like a failure, a man who had been caught in a moment of prejudice and now had to face the consequences. But then, as the weeks wore on, something changed. David noticed that James wasn't holding a grudge. He was fair, professional, and never once treated David with anything less than respect. And slowly, David began to realize that his own beliefs were changing. He started to see James not as the man he had rejected, but as his boss, someone worthy of the respect he had never given before. One day, as they crossed paths in the hallway, James gave him a nod. David, feeling a surge of responsibility, took a deep breath and said, "I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that to you." James paused, his expression unreadable, but then he smiled, a small but meaningful gesture. "Thank you, David. You're learning. That's all that matters." David felt a sense of relief wash over him. The tension between them dissolved, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could truly move forward.